Hi, welcome to More Christ. I'm your host, Marcus. Today I'm joined once more by one of my favorite guests and one of the first guests I actually had on my channel, Dr. Kevin Vost. He writes a lot of books, I must say. He's the author of more than a dozen or two, and he's bringing the knowledge of classical Greco-Roman and medieval scholastic philosophy, modern cognitive psychology, and high-intensity strength training to bear on issues of apologetics, saints' biography, spiritual growth, and physical fitness. So today we're actually just going to focus in on Dr. Vost's recent and wonderful book, You Are That Temple. I suppose just to begin then, Kevin, what inspired you to write the book and what do you hope that readers will take away from it then?
Sure. This is a book that has a primary emphasis on, physical fitness, but also looking at, mental, intellectual, and spiritual fitness. And several things inspired me to write it. I've been involved in strength training and physical fitness, almost all of my life. It's been one of my side interests. I was a competitive weightlifting instructor, and things like that. But the main impetus that led me to write this book is just a couple weeks ago, I turned 62 years old. And as I was, aging, I realized the importance of maintaining muscle mass and strength as I age. So at age 60, I set a goal in the deadlift exercise. I did 410 pounds for 5 repetitions. I felt that's pretty good, but my blood pressure was too high. My waistline was too big. I was overweight. And I realized that even my lifetime of fitness pursuits wasn't enough without a properly crafted diet. So a little over 2 years ago now, I really dug deep into some new research on the proper approach to the human diet that changed much of what I had learned throughout the decades. And I put them into practice. And the results for me were so dramatic. Within a few months, I had dropped 30 pounds of body weight. My waistline went down 6 inches. My blood pressure dropped by over 20 points, becoming within the normal range. All this without any medicine. So I was just so impressed by the power of kind of eating the way we were designed to do that I really wanted to get the word out there and put a new fitness book out that gave some of these new nutritional ideas I discovered, along with some refinements, what I'd also learned over the years on additional things about strength training and so forth, and then also tying it into the spiritual benefits that can come from that, how it's important for each one of us, regardless of what our age, to try to take proper care of our physical bodies.
Wonderful. And so something that I find interesting is that many New Age people whose theology is ostensibly anti-body and anti-creation, ironically, perhaps put a greater emphasis on the good of the body and healthy food than many Christians do. Why do you think that is, and how can Christians respond to these kind of adverse trends then, Kevin?
Yeah, that's a good point to make, because and throughout history of Christianity, there've been some various sects who have actually kind of seen the body as evil, and everything should be focused on the spirit. We have the Gnostics, the Manichees, the Albigensians, and others. But the sound teaching in the church, from the beginning, material things are good, and God crafted us as beings of both body and soul. He made us that way. And the Catholic Church teaching is Christ comes again after the second judgment, we will all be reunited with our bodies. And hopefully those of us in heaven are even going to be given these glorified bodies. So the proper church teaching should always be that the spirit is more important, but the body is important. It's a part of what we are, the way that God made us. So it should be up to us to give it proper care, to be proper stewards for it. And again, and the roots of that have always been there in church, even going back to the scripture. In St. Paul, 1 Corinthians was one of the places where it's most explicitly stated that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. God's Spirit dwells within us, and we're supposed to glorify God with our bodies. So in fact, my book title, You Are That Temple, is just a slight rewording from an English translation of 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, that temple you are.
Thanks for that, Kevin. And recently as well, there's been something of an explosion in books and habits and habit formation, I think taking us back in some ways to a theme common in classical education and civilization, since like St. Augustine and figures recently like Charlotte Mason in education. You explore this idea of temple builders in your book, people who've transformed their lives by making healthier choices and developing positive habits. Can you share maybe an example of a temple builder that's inspired you then?
Okay. Yeah, of the book ends with 3, like, called the Temple Tender Tales, 23 contemporary Catholics out there, men and women, who tell their own stories really hard because there are 23 there. One of them is even my own brother. So these modern Catholics are telling us, how taking proper care of their bodies, this can be in terms of exercise, diet, both, how that's impacted them physically, mentally, and spiritually. And it ranges from, there's an actual former Mr. Universe winner in this group, and people who are exercise experts, are also just everyday men and women. So for me, just to pick one story, wow, that's going to be hard to do. But I'll just give you one example of one of the first stories, because this is from another Catholic author, Lorraine Bennett, and she tells a little bit of her story of her husband Art too. So it's kind of a two in one. And this just surprised me because I was aware of Lorraine's wonderful books from Sophia Institute Press, my main publisher, and we'd also both written, I think, for Our Sunday Visitor and others. But I was aware of her as a wonderful author who wrote about relationship issues and, of course, spiritual issues. But just through Facebook, I made some posts about some changes in diet, and I found out that she had discovered the same kind of things that I was just learning about, but a few years ahead of my curve there. And is a lady, a few years older than me, and her husband is also. And she described when several years back now, even though too they were athletes all their life, she's a long distance runner, they had discovered that when they radically changed their diets, getting away from the standard diet, the ultra processed food, ate far more wholesome and natural foods, far lower sugars and processed carbohydrates, that it had just a dramatic impact on their health, on their body weight, on the way they felt, on their blood values and things. So it really kind of surprised me that I didn't know it, but she had stumbled across the same kind of things I did. But again, before me, they had a profound effect on a person who's been athletic, all of her life. But then also, I will say too, she also led me into some research I wasn't aware of. This dentist named Weston Price. He was from the United States of America, Cleveland, Ohio. And I believe it was mostly the 1930s. He's traveled around the world examining people of different cultures. He included a group there. I remember exactly, we're north of Scotland even. He did some Swiss people in a mountain village. Then he was with tribes in Africa. He was in South America. He was in the Pacific Islands. He was with the North American, some Indian groups, And what he's doing was, he was, of course, giving them full dental exams and all. He's also checking the overall bodily health. And he found dramatic impact in just a time of one generation, when people from around the world with different traditional diets, when they had switched to the processed foods, when they had switched to, now they're receiving sugars, now they're receiving canned foods, now they're receiving white flour and this kind of thing. In the little one generation, their dental health deteriorated, and so did the physical health. And he even showed photos of these two groups. So that was just one thing that impacted me from having to come across Lorraine's story. It opened this other world that I hadn't yet examined, of this research that compares people when they eat their traditional diets versus when they change to ultra processed diets, and how fast the changes can come about in the next generation's health.
Thanks for sharing, Kevin. And in the book, you highlight the absurdity of how different foods become the villain for a time, only to be replaced with a kind of new scapegoat. Why is this catastrophizing trend maybe come to the fore? And I suppose in line with what you've already described, what do you proffer instead then?
Yeah, and that, and there's a truth there too, because again, to put it, in context, I've been involved like in the weightlifting and fitness world steadily since the mid 1970s, for a long, long time. So I was interested in nutrition, the kind that you get from the bodybuilding magazines that may or not be suspect, but also the mainstream stuff that comes in the official nutrition textbooks and all. So I always tried to follow, a reasonably healthy diet, or at least what was considered healthy. But I found that as I aged, I could still be strong, I could still be physically fit, but some of my health parameters were suffering, as far as increased body fat, blood pressure, and so on. So that was, part of my motivation to do this, because I do recall, just growing up, hey, it's the 1980s. All of a sudden, these so-called low-fat and light foods are everywhere. We have this health cookie now called Snackwell. It is lower in fat than your traditional Oreos, So we had all these things, we had all this drive to reduce the fat in our diet, and almost without fail, what came in to replace it was sugar. At the same time, certain foods people have eaten for millennia, things like eggs and butter, were relatively demonized. That's going to clog up your heart. It's going to cause all these problems. Where the new manufactured foods, margarines, artificial oils, those were praised and sold to us as things that were good for our health. But I discovered over the decades that in my opinion, it seems to be virtually the exact opposite, that the farther we've gone away from ancestral foods, the more troubles it has given us. So again, as a person who kind of lived this, who lived from both sides, I was really shocked the difference it made to my own health, and to then my brother, my wife, others around me when we started doing this, when we went more back towards the ancestral diet. So again, yes, but yes, you've had the trends, you've seen the trends, and I do talk about a few of those in the book. Like for a time, eggs were demonized. That's going to raise your cholesterol, it's going to give you a heart attack. And then for a time, then they realized, well, wait a minute, just eating foods that are high in cholesterol don't necessarily raise your own body's cholesterol, because your body tends to make about 4 times as much as what comes into the diet. So if you take in more, your body produces less. So there was a time there when they were saying, well, stay away just from the egg yolks. You could eat the white, have a white omelet, because that's mostly protein. There's very little fat there. And then decades passed, and like, whoops, wait a minute, we were wrong. There's a lot of good stuff in those yolks. There's these fat-soluble vitamins that has protein of its own. It has healthy fats. So anyway, I've just seen it. I've been there following this for the decades, and then seen foods that were lionized, then become demonized, and vice versa. So I really wanted to dig in deep and try to find out, what seems to be the real truth here, at least as best as we can get to it now. And I also enjoyed learning the story of how all this happened. There were some very good books out. One's called The Big Fat Surprise. The other is called Good Calories, Bad Calories. First is Nina Teicholz, the second's Gary Taubes, and there's others. So I just found it pretty fascinating to learn where our dietary recommendations have come from, the changes in the last 50 to 60 years. And then another personal parallel, from 1984 to 2016, my full-time day job was in disability evaluation for America's Social Security Disability Program. So from children, on through elderly adults, I read 500 to 700 people's medical records every year, right as epidemics developed here in the US of obesity, diabetes, fatty liver disease, and others. So I kind of saw all this unfolding before my eyes. So as I look back on it now, I can see, boy, there's been a tremendous impact that has come in the changes in our diet in America, and not only America. The guidelines there in Great Britain pretty much followed our own a few years later, and most of the other developed countries kind of took their lead from us, in South Africa, Australia, and others. So to me, it just became fascinating as I started to dig into this story, try to learn the history, see why we were recommended, what we were recommended, and then to apply the personal changes within my own diet, and just to see actually the result, what happens.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kevin. So I suppose applying those ancestral principles and the best of modern science, what does a balanced diet look like for average Joe, as it were, involving, as you mentioned, carbs, healthy fats, and proteins? And how do we get that balance between them then?
Yeah, sure. And I say one thing, maybe to put it in a really stronger context too, that a lot of research here in the United States has shown, because, I do talk about like lowering carbohydrates, hiring healthy fats. I talk about the importance of protein, so those macronutrients. But kind of the more fundamental lesson, even before that, which we kind of hinted on, is just eat real food as much as possible. Avoid the artificial man-made foods to the extent you can, and emphasize those foods that have been here, forever. Because there's research, like, in the US, where in my lifetime, obesity among children has like quadrupled. When I was a kid in the 60s, it said 1 out of 20 children were obese, and now it is 1 out of 5. Okay, so it's quadrupled and still rising. And some studies reported in our journal, the American Medical Association, showed that by 1999, it was 61% of the food that American children ate between ages 3 and 18, 61% was this ultra-processed food that didn't exist, maybe 100 years ago. And then by 2014, that had even risen further to 67%. So more than 2/3 of what American kids and teens eat now are these packaged processed foods, not fruits and vegetables and milk. and meat and fish, and grain, things like that. So it's really, really significant to see this drastic change in the kind of food we're eating at the same time these health problems are just becoming rampant. And similar findings have been found with diabetes. It used to be very, very rare in children because they used to talk about type 2 diabetes as adult onset diabetes and type 1 is childhood onset. But now so many children are getting this other kind of more common type 2 diabetes, they no longer distinguish it that way. So anyway, yeah, a fundamental distinction I make is between the real foods and the ultra processed foods. And one way I try to make this graphic is I just give a verse from Ezekiel 4:9, and it says in there, it says, I don't remember the exact ingredients, but it says like, take oats and take millet and take barley and this and that, a couple other things, and put them together and make a bread. But they're all just natural grains, seeds. And then right below that, I give this list that has, sterol 92B, glycerol, soy lecithin, blah, blah, blah. And it's the actual ingredients list from one of our modern breads, and it couldn't be more different. It's just full of chemicals. So one of the fundamental principles there is just as much as possible, just try to eat foods that are real, that don't have a label because they're just what they are. They're one ingredient, there's an apple, there's an orange, there's a piece of steak, there's shrimp, there's, your broccoli. So as much as possible, I recommend that people try to simply just eat more real food and decrease the amount of that packaged food. Like if there's some packaged food that's your absolute favorite, doesn't mean you can never eat that again. Well, I wouldn't recommend that. But I would say try to reduce the things that are questionable, reduce those and increase just a basic real food. So that's one of the first steps. And another way to look at it is try to eat foods people say that come from a field or a farm or a forest, not a factory. Another way to look at that. So that's one of the fundamental principles, which is, go through your own diet, go through your own cupboards and say, hey, how much of this could my great grandparents have eaten, and how much of this didn't even exist at that time? And then the stuff that didn't exist at that time, that's what you want to really question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. And I think aside from that, another element I like of your work is in contrast to, and Dr. George Sheehan mentioned this years ago too, in contrast to the modern notion of health oftentimes seems to be merely a lack of illness, which is such a low bar. Instead, it seems you're offering this more integrated picture, which includes a healthy relationship with food and creation. And you also go into the importance of exercise, and you highlighted a number of different types of exercise and then apply those to different population groups and so on. I just want to go through maybe some of those, from barbell exercises to high intensity training to aerobic exercises. Can you tell us a little bit maybe about each of those and what role they can play in building our temples then?
Yeah, absolutely. Because for one thing, with strength training in general, well, in one, I tie the nutrition exercise into the classical virtues. So one I bring into play for strength training is the virtue of fortitude. Which Thomas Aquinas says one aspect is either overcoming difficult obstacles to the good, or enduring difficulties, to maintain a good. So I think, weight training, that's all about overcoming difficult obstacles, to achieve some kind of good. And in the past, even when I was a young man in the 1970s, starting out, it was kind of seen as an odd thing if you trained, if you lifted weights, even for men, even for athletes, because it was considered for a long time that it's all cosmetic. It's about making your muscles bigger, or if you're a weightlifter, just making you stronger, but it's not considered to have great health effects. But as the decades have gone by, they realized that's not the case at all. A lot of research on aging has found that two of the most important biomarkers for longevity and for keeping your functional capacity as you age, the number 1 and 2 are muscle mass and muscle strength. There's even been a ream of research over decades that shows in older people, even a measure of grip strength. You get a dynamometer and just see how strong is that grip. That tends to predict how long people live and how functional they are at the end of life, because muscles are important. They're what allow us to do all of our bodily daily movements, And as we get older, being strong doesn't mean, hey, I can tell people I'm 80 years old and I deadlifted 300 pounds, but it can mean, hey, I'm 80 years old and I can walk uphill by myself and I don't need a cane and I'm not in a wheelchair, So there's really practical, functional benefits to that. So yeah, one of the things I do focus on is different methods of strength training. And I think the one I cover in 2nd of 3 chapters is on this, what's called high intensity training. And that's my favorite. It's the kind I've been doing most of my life. And the bottom line there is, if you do strength training properly in this, what's called high intensity method, a little dose goes a long, long way. As little as one workout per week, taking less than a half an hour, can make substantial gains in strength. If you're already very strong, it will allow you to keep all your own strength. And I did this myself in my 30s and 40s when I was super busy with the family and working full time and doing other things part-time and all that. So I talk about this high intensity training. I talk a little bit about newer methods where people, it's called super slow training, or where a person may take 5 or even 10 seconds, in each direction of an exercise. And the motions like this method was first studied with elderly people with osteoporosis, looking for a way to maintain or build muscle mass without damaging their joints. So even though some of these methods are called high intensity, they're some of the most joint friendly that you can do. So I talk a little bit about those, again, that very brief high intensity training. I also have a chapter of the more traditional training that you see at gyms, the barbell based training, things like focused around basic pushing motions like a bench press or an overhead press, basic pulling motions like a chin up or a down or a pull down of some kind, or some kind of a rowing motion, and then a basic leg exercise like a deep knee bend, and also basic hinging exercise like where you're bending over and coming back, working the lower back muscles. So very simple workouts can be built around as little as 3 or 4 exercises. If you do like an overhead press and then a chin up and then a deep knee bend, you've almost worked all the muscles of your body in a very, very efficient way by doing some of the proper kind of exercise. So I have a chapter talking about that. There's another chapter, it's a little more specialized. This would be for people who either belong to a gym or they have a very well-equipped home gym, though it can also be done just with the bench and dumbbells. But these are this bodybuilder named Doug Brignoli, who unfortunately has passed within the last year. But he pioneered these exercises based on the proper biomechanics of the human body, where again, you can do certain exercises causing the least possible trauma to your joint. So I talk about that too in the first section of 3 chapters devoted to primarily strength training, building and strengthening our muscles. And then I move into some other aspects of fitness after that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. And you discussed this idea of temporal raiders, harmful habits and behaviors that can damage our bodies and souls. Can you maybe share some examples of common temporal raiders and how we can guard against them then?
Yeah, for things I do early in the book, I have a chapter I call The Virtues of Fitness, where I'm saying how different, virtues, which Thomas Aquinas again points out, are basically good habits, which lead to good behaviors, whereas vices or bad habits that lead to bad behaviors we call sins. So we want to train ourselves toward virtue, towards the right kind of habits that will build the right kind of moral character. And they can also help us become fit, because Thomas, borrowing from Aristotle, says that virtues are to the soul what health and beauty and fitness are to the body. They're perfections of what we are. So they should go together hand in hand. But yeah, so when I talk about building these virtues of fitness in our soul, they're going to counter, some bad and negative habits. And one, people often associate the rising obesity epidemic with the vice or the sin of gluttony, eating too much, eating inappropriate, and the sin of sloth, which the actual spiritual sin of sloth means not caring about the things of God. It's not only physical laziness. But when people are using sloth in this context, they usually mean lazy. Oh, I'm too heavy. That means I'm glutton. I'm eating all the time, and I'm lazy. I don't move like I should. But I'm trying to show how research in nutrition shows it's a little bit more complicated than that. That if we can get over these bad habits of eating all these ultra processed foods, and I tend to go into the reasons why, because they tend to be made purposely to be very high in sugar, high in fat, and high in salt. These are things that make us hungrier. They don't satisfy us. They make us want to eat more. So if we can train ourselves to eat more of the real foods, they're higher in natural proteins and natural fats, many people report their natural tendencies toward gluttony just kind of fade away, because they're simply not that hungry anymore, because the food they're eating gives them satiety. The nutrition satisfies them. We're designed to want to eat so we can nourish our bodies. And modern day people may find when they start properly nourishing their bodies, some of those bad habits are going to go by the wayside because you're no longer even tempted. So if a person has a bad habit of a horrible sweet tooth or something, this kind of diet for many people can help them overcome it. Like I was that way myself. I would snack at nighttime. And I remember I would alternate between sweet and salty snacks. I'd eat something sweet until I was sick of it. And that's too sweet. I better go get something salty. So then I go get my salty food and it's like, oh man, that's too much salt. I need something sweet now to temper that, and go back and forth. But since I've adapted eating this way, that does not happen at all. So another side benefit for that, because I know many people do complain that their problem is nighttime eating, especially people who would sit back to watch television or something. But so I also talk about fasting and also just time restricted eating. And many people have found that if they can eat the more satisfying foods, finish their eating at an earlier hour in the day to give a bigger nap before you go to bed, many people will find they're able to go the rest of the night without constantly nibbling. And people who suffer from things like reflux at night, it may completely vanish, as it did for me. I had times I would wake up at night and just have this coming up in my throat, almost choking me, or I'd have to go take antacids. And since I've eaten this way, it's been totally gone. So anyway, if people start eating a more wholesome diet, it's possible that some of those bad nutritional habits will kind of fade away because they just won't be tempting anymore. And on the other side of this, if a person feels like I don't have the energy to get up and do anything or go exercise, well, there's hope there too. Because I'm showing you, like, at least for strength training, we're not talking about getting up at 5 every morning and training for an hour every day. That can be as little as once a week. But also, when we tend to rein our diets in and eat more nutritionally satisfying food, I mean, I can attest this, all kinds of people can attest, your natural energy level tends to rise. So now, I do feel like doing something. Well, maybe it's not going to the gym, but I feel like walking my dog, or I feel like going and mowing my lawn with a push mower instead of hopping on a rider, things like that. So I will just say that many of the vices or bad habits of sedentary behavior and of poor eating, they can almost correct themselves when we start feeding our bodies the way God, crafted them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kevin. And I think alongside the sins that you mentioned, there seems to be a particular danger maybe of pride today in a culture, especially influenced by secularist kind of expressive individualism and showing off. And that's exacerbated by the social media and things like that. We cultivate these images of ourselves, very manicured images of ourselves. I suppose in contrast to that, then, how do you suggest readers balance this desire to care for their bodies and maintain physical and spiritual health with the Christian virtue of humility, which emphasizes the importance of interior transformation and not just the external appearance?
No, that's exactly right. A very important point. And I give a quote here that from Pope Pius from the 1950s, when he would talk to athletic groups of athletes and so forth. He would talk about training the body. And in one of his quotes, he says, the Catholic Church is wholeheartedly in favor of physical culture. And I like that. That's like an old-fashioned term for the proper care of the body. He says, if it be kept in proper proportion. And then he talks about what he means by proper proportion. He says, like, when it does not lead to worship of the body, when the body doesn't become an idol, right? The sense that I'm going to worship the body and I'm going to be proud, have everyone look at me. He said it should give us energy rather than drain us. Some people get so involved in athletics, they don't have the energy to do their normal activities or play with their kids, because they're so obsessed with training their body. He said it should, lead to the actually harmony within families instead of, disharmony from taking the time away from them. So yeah, that is crucial. So one of the ways I like to look at that is that, if you're training your body this way over time, chances are, you'll look somewhat better. You'll be somewhat leaner. You'll develop some muscles, and that's fine, but that should be more of a side effect. That's not the main goal here. So the importance here in physical terms should be more on function than form or how that you look. So you're training this way, like, now I have energy. I feel good. I can go do the things I need to do for my family. I can carry the grandkids up the stairs now, these things like that. So that should be the main goal, that the good that's going to come from it, that we're going to feel better. We're going to have more energy. We can do the things, take care of the responsibilities that we're supposed to using our physical bodies. But again, getting back to St. Paul, the ultimate goal here should be, we're going to do this to glorify the God that gave us these bodies. It's going to, in a sense, we're going to be showing our gratitude to God by taking care of them, So we're not going to want to go around and say to everybody else, hey, look at this, look at what I did, We're going to have more of an interior attitude of, God, thank you for giving me this body. Now, please help me keep it healthy and functional so I can serve others, for your glory through it.
Amen. And I think once you establish that hierarchy, as you suggest, and attend to the first things first, you in your book, I think you also then building on that, explore the proper role of things like beauty and aesthetics in Christian spirituality. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit and how our surroundings, say, and things that we surround ourselves with, how they can impact our spiritual lives then.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because, there's an old saying from one of the great motivational speakers I used to listen to when I was young. I think it was W. Clement Stone. He said, this is expressed throughout Western civilizations and other civilizations, probably their wisdom, but, that we tend to become what we think about. Another way is, that we're strongly influenced by our environments. So I would say that then, yeah, okay, then be careful what you think about and be careful of the kind of environment you put yourself in. So yeah, what we surround ourselves with, if it is this popular culture that's demeaning the body, that's treating it purely, as an object, purely as a material thing without spiritual value, we want to just be very, very careful and examine our conscience. To what extent are we exposing us to this versus to what extent are we exposing us to things that lift us up? And I would think, obviously in things in terms like music, are we listening to music that has really vile and heinous messages behind us? What effect does that have? We think, oh, I'm just going to ignore that. What effect does that really have when it's constantly going through your mind, as opposed to listening to things that are more pure and more uplifting? The same with whatever we watch. The same in terms of beauty, of physical beauty. It's one thing, for a man, woman, and to recognize that beauty, and maybe realize this woman's physically attractive, but that itself is not necessarily a sin. Just recognizing that physical beauty there. What becomes a sin is if we then dwell on that, think about what we're trying to get that person or imagining it, then we're cultivating that and turning it into sin, turning a temptation into a sin. When we're faced with a beautiful body, if we can, first just say, well, acknowledge that's a beautiful body. God does good work, but remembering there's also physical beauty in every single person. And that person you're seeing, they're not just a body. They have a soul inside that's going to live forever. And that person, if it's a woman, she's somebody's daughter. She may be somebody's mother or wife or so on. So part of the proper recognition of the body is to never forget that we are ensouled bodies. We're never just bodies. So I think, the proper care of the body should be totally in line with the spirit and in serving spiritual goals. So we can have a sense of gratitude for God. Thank you for giving other people their wonderful bodies, but never forgetting, because I do have a chapter in there too where I talk about physical and mental disability. Every body is a temple. So this is not intended to be any kind of cult of the body beautiful. We talk about a famous saint, Margaret of Castello, who was born with all these deformities, blind and deaf and a dwarf with a hunchback and serrated teeth. And she goes on to serve others and become a great saint. So part of this message is, that we have all been given a great gift through having a physical body, and we can just do what's within our power to take care of it. Some of us cannot exercise whatsoever. But even these people may be able to some extent to regulate what they eat, and in their interaction with other people, they might be able to help motivate and educate them towards taking better care of their bodies. So I'm hoping this message is one of, just gratitude and appreciation for the human body, whatever the particular state of any individual's own body is at this point in time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. And in the book, you also draw upon your extensive experience as a psychologist and touch upon the relationship between physical health and mental health. I suppose especially important at a time now when there's so much talk about mental health crisis. And I know in Ireland, and it's probably the same in the USA, there's an explosion in suicides and things like that. And I know in America, seen some awful documentaries about people getting addicted to over-the-counter drugs and things like that, and how
Yes.
is it amphetamines are destroying the society in many places. I suppose, in what sense does caring for our bodies also benefit us in these ways and in our emotional and mental well-being?
Yeah, that's a very important question, because you are so right. And we do have these disturbing trends in the US, as well as in other countries with our rising rates of suicide and mental health problems among the young people, and adults. So it's very disconcerting, and it's multi-complex, multiple reasons why that are physical and mental and spiritual, social, the relationship changes. I mean, that all absolutely all impacts. But some of them, the actual physical components can be significant, and sometimes they are overlooked. The traditional therapy for mental disorders, and I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and there's great value in these for many people, is the talking forms of psychotherapy. Especially popular today are these cognitive therapies that reframe the way you look at things. And I really, those always made the greatest sense to me. And I'm also a fan of the ancient Stoic philosophy, which has much in common with this. The way we can change our attitudes and judgments can impact our emotions. So there's value there. And for certain conditions in psychiatry, certain medications can make a world of difference for some people. So these things we've widely known, but we're just kind of beginning to learn more about the impact on both physical exercise and nutrition on maintaining our mental health, and even if there are already mental health issues, possibly lessening them, making them better. So just for one, for exercise, there's a great book written by a psychiatrist here in the U.S., maybe 10 or 12 years ago now, called Spark by John Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y, and he's showing all these studies were showing for endurance type exercise and strength training exercises, the fact that it stimulates all kinds of things in the brain. Most people are familiar with these endorphins, like the natural morphine-like things, the runner's high. You exercise, hey, I feel these particular drugs in my brain, or drug-like chemicals in my brain. But we're finding there's all kinds of brain chemicals, neurotransmitters, different hormones that are stimulated in a positive way by different kinds of exercise. And also things like testosterone and growth hormone, things that will repair and build our tissues, are actually stimulated by exercise. And I remember reading in this Ratey's book, and he's primarily a distance runner, and he has lots of studies. He starts with this a high school in Naperville, Illinois, which is outside of Chicago, just a couple hundred miles north of me, and showing how when they went into they changed their physical education classes, and instead of having them just kind of standing around and playing games now and then, they actually did aerobic exercise, and it showed how their scores on their academic tests just kind of went through the ceiling by having this regular stimulation, this blood circulation that comes from that aerobic exercise. And he had many other studies showing people like schizophrenics that had some improvements, people with various cognitive problems that had either measurable improvements in their brain when they looked at the flow, or actual cognitive improvements in performance on tests. So anyway, he goes through this with all kinds of groups and all kinds of mental disorders. But I remember at one point when he's talking about what stimulates the most production of these positive hormones, and he's saying that it's intense exercise. So being a fan of the high intensity training, I like that. But so he was saying that if you're physically able, things like doing occasional sprints tend to have a greater response in these hormones than just running slower for steady state. So a person who's able to, or if you're on a bike or something, you might want to occasionally do a hard interval and then back off. But he said that the research showed what stimulated these positive responses more than any was old-fashioned barbell squats. And from being a weightlifter from way back, squats was always called the king or the queen of the exercises, because people realized that it was hard to even get ultimate strength and development in your upper body if you weren't doing this deep knee bend, this squat. And now they're kind of showing why, because using those large muscle masses all together has this positive stimulus for the brain. So again, we're finding more and more about many, many positive effects, not just in our muscles or even in our bones, but in the brains themselves from physical exercise. And there's kind of in some ways, an even newer field out there now, where people are looking at the impact of proper nutrition on mental health. There are a few people out there now who call themselves nutritional psychiatrists. There's a man named, the psychiatrist from Harvard named Chris Palmer, who within the last few months has written a book about metabolism and mental health. Another one is a psychiatrist, Dr. Georgia Ede. And there are others. There's a few others out there. So we're finding more and more that what we eat can have significant impact on a whole variety of mental disorders, from the ADHD, which seems to be so rampant on children, all the way up towards the end of life. In fact, there are some researchers now who are calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes, the theory being that the kind of blood sugar and insulin abnormalities that lead to diabetes may over time be the same kind of things that cause the brain damage that results in dementia later in life. So again, we're kind of early on in this. We don't know a great deal, but there's a lot to point us to the value of physical exercise and proper nutrition, not only for bodily health, but for mental health in terms of cognition and in terms of mood stabilization.
Thanks for sharing, Kevin. And you also discussed the importance of rest and recovery. I suppose, again, especially important alongside what we've mentioned in a culture of busyness, and we stay up late at night, eat unhealthily, and so on, as you say. Can you maybe share some tips or practices for readers who do struggle with prioritizing rest and recovery in their busy lives?
Yeah, that's a good one too, because so often we're thinking, okay, I'm going to take care of myself, so then I'm going to train every day, and do all these things. And we may actually make things worse by overtaxing ourselves, because, when we do exercise, especially strength training, you're causing kind of a breakdown of tissue. Then you need that adaptive response where you build back even stronger next time. But that takes a period of rest. And I know now there's all kinds of modalities out there that people will do to try to recover. And there can be some value to these, hot and cold therapy, different types of massage and everything. They can certainly have their value, but still probably the absolute number one most important thing is plain old rest and plain old sleep. Because, that's as God made us. That's nature's, natural restorative. But if we keep ourselves hyper-stimulated, if we're on the electronics all through the day, especially at night, it can throw off those natural rhythms and run us down. So I do say absolutely, rest is very, very important. And again, that was another thing that led me into the high intensity type strength training, because part of that idea is you train intensely, but briefly and infrequently. So you allow your body time to rest. And how that will work out for an individual person can vary and vary across a person's lifespan. Like I mentioned, in my younger years, 30s and 40s, when I was extremely busy with work and family, I would strength train as little as once a week. Well, I'm retired now, except for writing and speaking a little bit, so I can train whenever I want. So now, sometimes recognizing the value of rest and being 62 now, sometimes I will train every day for a period of weeks and feel just fine. But when I do that, my workouts are extremely brief. Like I went into the gym today, did a side shoulder motion for the side lateral deltoid, and did a hyperextension motion for the lower back, did some warm-up sets, did one real set, and drove home. And most days I'll do that. I may do one upper body exercise, one lower body exercise, either at home or the gym, and that's it. So I've done something brief, I've done something intense, and that's over. And I forgot to say too, another benefit now they're showing in strength training too is it helps regulate our blood sugars. Because the muscles store this glycogen, a form of a sugar energy in the muscles, and when you use that, when you drain it, your body needs to compensate and can draw some excess sugars away from places they shouldn't be and use them to replenish your muscles. But anyway, it will vary how it plays out from person to person, depending on your life circumstances and your age. But your key point there is fundamental. Rest and recovery are every bit as important as the stimulus that you give in terms of exercise.
Excellent. And in your book, you do show this healthy respect for people of different ages and different abilities, which I think is most important. I suppose just practically applying that, how can different readers incorporate the advice and guidance in the book into some of their different daily lives and routines then?
Yeah, and I try to address that going through there, because like I have one section when I talk about weightlifting, I said the heading is, but I don't want to be a weightlifter. I'm like, well, that's fine. You don't have to. That's not what we're about here. The main message is that there's some method of moving the body, and there's some method of feeding the body. We all have to do both, but everyone's going to be able to find something that works best for them. So, to try to find a form of exercise that you enjoy, that builds you up, that does not hurt you. And same with your eating. Eat the kind of foods that seem to work best with you, to make you feel best, that don't upset, your stomach, that lead to good blood values when you go to your doctors for your test. But then I do have specific chapters towards the end. One is geared towards some special needs of women and children, the other towards the elderly, and another chapter for people with mental and physical disabilities, because kind of the bottom line is the most fundamental principles throughout the book, like real food feeds, applies to everybody. But yeah, depending on your sex, depending on your age, there are some special considerations. And one, especially for children, is very important now because, we're having these epidemics now in children's health that didn't used to be there. The vastly growing obesity, the vastly growing diabetes, for two examples. And some people say, well, some of this has a genetic basis. And yeah, there is some genetic basis to any physical condition or disorder. There's always the bell curved distribution. Some people naturally tend to be very thin. Others tend to have a lot of fat. Most people are somewhere in the middle. But the fact that that curve itself has shifted so dramatically just in a couple of generations shows that's not genetics, that's lifestyle. That's the way we're eating, the way that we're exercising. So I do try to emphasize that. For the first time ever in one of my books, I came across a lot of books recently that talk about the importance of what a woman eats while she is pregnant, kind of setting the stage for the health of the unborn child. So just one interesting fact there that I hadn't realized before my recent research. Vitamin D deficiency has been known for a long time to cause a bone disease of rickets. So things have become fortified in vitamin D. You don't hear too often about cases of rickets anymore. But lesser vitamin D deficiency has actually become very, very common. And the one thing I didn't realize, and I recently confirmed this with a daughter-in-law, is that for now, at least in the United States, women who are breastfeeding their babies, they recommend that they supplement the babies with some vitamin D. I don't remember if it was 400 international units, but a certain amount of vitamin D has become the common practice now. And you're thinking, well, how could that be? If women have breastfed their babies for, God only knows exactly how long, how come now we need to supplement this vitamin D? And one thing, one of the main things that produces vitamin D in our body is the body's exposure to sunlight. And it does that through actually the cholesterol within our body is one thing it uses to transform it for this vitamin D. And for decades, we've been advised, to stay out of the sun. So we're probably getting less sun. And also as our diets have changed, it seems we're getting less vitamin D. So I know I do cite one particular study in there where pregnant women were given a fairly high dose of vitamin D supplementation while pregnant, or no, was it while pregnant or shortly after? But anyway, they no longer were required to give the babies the vitamin D because now the breast milk had enough. And I believe the research said it was only in the last 75 to 100 years or so that this has happened, that it never used to be an issue. So we need to look at things like that. When things change over time, when there's a new medical practice, to ask, well, why? How come that wasn't necessary in the past and it is now? So I think, for virtually every age group, we need to look at these issues that are out there. Infertility through this polycystic ovarian syndrome and things like that. I briefly just some of those. For the elderly, for older people, one of the main emphasis there is the importance of muscle, trying to maintain your muscle as you get older. And the two main factors there found through the empirical research, the two main things are increased intake of protein and the proper kind of strength training exercise. So I do kind of trying to show that proper care of the body is there for every age of the lifespan. Oh, and I'm going to go on and on, but one other thing I forgot to mention too is that, there is the obesity epidemic is also impacting infants. Babies are now becoming obese. So it's not like they're sitting around and saying, hey, give me some Cheetos. They're just eating whatever it is that they've been fed, and their motions are just naturally ingrained. So there's something wrong probably with our food supply. And maybe the formulas they're taking and so on. It's even leading to this in infancy. So for every period of lifespan, we need to just take the time to seriously try to figure out what is healthiest for us, what is healthiest for our loved ones to maximize our health throughout the lifespan.
Excellent. Most important. Thank you, Kevin. And I suppose just as we come to a close this evening, then, if we might take it back to the big picture that you offer with the book. So in the final chapter, you discuss the goal of our life as Christians to become these living tabernacles or dwelling places for God. Can you elaborate a bit on this idea and what it means again for our spiritual journey?
Yes, exactly. I kind of go back to the original lesson, why we started, we try to keep our body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. And in that early chapter too, I also mentioned when Thomas was talking about what Jesus said was the most important of all, to love God with our mind and heart and soul and strength, with all of that, and to love our neighbor as ourself. That Thomas says when we're instructed to love ourself, that includes a proper love of our body. because our self is a body and soul unity. So Jesus has told us, take care of your bodily temple. So that's kind of been hopefully the whole motivation, for the whole book that precedes it. I later have like reading recommendations, the idea that our body is so important, it's worth devoting some time to now and again through the rest of our life to make sure we're up to date with what really is most likely to keep us healthy. But I also talk about the term templum, which also meant like a temple ground, like consecrated ground around that temple. So I kind of give the analogy that also, yeah, we're going to take care of ourselves, but we learn from Genesis, God made everything, and everything was good, and he called us to be stewards of creation. So I also talk about, yes, there really are ecological and environmental impacts to what we eat. Whether we decide we're going to eat animals or not, which I do, and I give multiple reasons in the book on protein and other things. But whether we're going to be a vegan or a carnivore, or for most of us somewhere in between, we want to do this in a way that respects creation as much as possible. So we wouldn't want to be raising animals in very inhumane conditions, or we wouldn't want to strip vast swaths of forest to put in monocrop fields necessarily either. So part of the message there is also, and it's going to vary for person to person wherever you happen to live, but it also kind of goes back to the old idea of trying to kind of, eat locally. Support the farmers around you, support the growers around you, because historically people have been healthiest when they have eaten the foods of their own locale that they or their ancestors, perhaps have grown up in. So that's just part of the other theme I try to keep in that book. So, even though we're going to take care of our temple, it's not like, hey, all that matters is my own health, the heck with the rest of the world. No, the world's important too. So we want to, eat properly in a way that does justice to the environment, that does justice to animals, that doesn't strip the land. And then there are ways that can be done. And my hope is that, we can move back more towards that. Things like regenerative farming that help restore our soil. So anyway, I try to end on a note that we're going to try to remember to see all this in terms of the big picture, showing God gratitude, not only for our own bodies, but for this, beautiful planet as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kevin. And just finally then, where can viewers or listeners learn more about you and your work, including your recent book?
Okay, sure. The book itself, called You Are That Temple, A Catholic Guide to Health and Holiness, is published by Sophia Institute Press, and their website is sophiainstitute.com, and it's, of course, available through other internet sellers. And if you're lucky enough to have a local Catholic bookstore, they may have it or be able to. My own website, I don't really keep it the most up-to-date or anything, but there's a comment box on the bottom if someone would like to contact me. That's just drvost.com, just drvost.com.
Thank you so much for your time today, Kevin. God bless you.
Oh, thank you, Marcus. It is always my pleasure.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there.